And now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Ginni Rometty is Chairman, President, and CEO of IBM. Born and raised in Chicago, Ginni graduated with an engineering degree from Northwestern University. She joined IBM in 1981 as a systems engineer in Detroit. In 2012, she was named Chairman, President, and CEO, becoming only the 9th chair executive in IBM's 105-year history. Since that time, she's been transforming IBM into a cognitive solutions and cloud platform company that leverages the power of innovation, data, and expertise to improve business and society. She is boldly leading IBM and its clients into the era of cognitive business. Ginni has been named to Fortune's Most Powerful Women list for more than 10 years consecutively. She serves on the Council on Foreign Relations, the Board of Trustees at Northwestern University, and the Board of Overseers and Board of Managers of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ginni Rometty. Thank you.
Well, I should first, though, just tell you, when I landed this afternoon, there is something about when you land and it's home. And I don't know how many of you, if you've been away from home for long, I have so many things to be grateful for from this city. Not just my family, but my friends. I was saying to Ed knew me and mentored me when I was a young pup here, to Northwestern, to so many clients that are here. So it is a great feeling. So I hope you'd heard of Watson before you watched that little clip. Did any? My team was going to make sure you'd heard of Watson by then. So look, I will talk a little bit about that later tonight. This is something that is so meaningful, I think, to the world, and we'll speak a bit. But I hope you take away tonight from my little time up front here something that is really not about technology, maybe just at the root. You know, at a group like this, an economic club, I think everybody thinks about competitive advantage and what's the basis of competitive advantage. You think about it if you have a company, your products, your services. I think you think about it a lot if you're a country. We talk a lot about that now these days. If for yourself, for whether it is a city, even like Chicago. And usually the basis of competitive advantage doesn't change that often. But I wanted to start our time by suggesting that it actually is changing right now. And I would summarize it in a single word, simple word, data. Now you might think, oh, that does sound like technology. But I don't mean if sort of you vision a tsunami of data or a big haystack. That isn't really what I'm talking about. The metaphor I would use, because it's not about volume, I think we're entering an era with this basis is more of a metaphor of oil and a natural resource. And if you think about oil as a natural resource, think about who the value goes to. And it has to be refined, extracted, processed, and out of that comes, whether it's electricity, petroleum, food, all sorts of different things come out of that. But it has to go through that process. So to kick us off, I was going to just tee up 5 quick questions and answer them myself. But as I said, in the end, it's not about technology. But I am going to start with that thought. So if data is actually this new form of your competitive advantage, the basis, so what's actually in all that data that I'm talking about? So if you were a doctor, you saw a little bit of this on the video here. Perhaps you've lost track, but already there are 80 million MRIs that have been taken. I was telling someone over cocktails, probably half of those are from my husband's, all his surgeries. But there are 80 million now. There have been 500,000 genes sequenced. And there are, if you look at cancer articles written, there are 100,000 articles written in a year. So what could a doctor know? Those of you that are in consumer or retail businesses, there are only 3.5 million searches done per minute. 90% of you out there allow people to know everything about you by turning on geo-tracking on your phone. I am in the 10% because I know what they do with that data. And the uploading, 500 hours of video per minute are uploaded, and what's in it? Or if those of you that run a company, your security manager, Well, there's only 10,000 research papers to read every day, 600,000 forms of malware, that 400,000 have had a change made, a variant every single day. So I bring that all up because this is a world of all of this data, but what's in it? Which takes me to my second question, which, okay, not only what's in it, but where is this data? And I think something that's very much overlooked, it's not the data that you search out on the internet. 20% of all of the world's data is searchable. 80% is in your company. It's in your possession, and that's where all the value lies. Everyone thinks it's the other way around. Not true. So what do you need if you wanted to make sense of all of this data? So if you allow me, that's really what was behind what you watched there. Until today, every past era of computing was never able to do anything with that data. It's a new era. Watson is just an example of that era. It's what we call cognitive, but these are systems that you don't program. They understand, they reason, and they learn over data. And that means that they can even develop senses like you and I have. So if I just use ours as an example, our Watson, the ability to see. If you had a melanoma, we're now 95% accurate looking at a lesion that's actually a melanoma. The ability to hear. You probably will believe this, but when people have a conversation, you'll miss 5% of the words. Hopefully, you're not going to miss like 25% tonight, okay? But 5% on average. We're already up to 5.5% with Watson. Ability to read, all right? 12 languages. That's 90% of the internet population in the world. And then the ability to feel, sensor, motion, and the like. But what would be made possible then with all of that? Why do I even tee this all up? Well, what's actually made possible is to transform every industry, every company, and I think every profession. So it was an interesting experience I had, this most recent annual report I did. I don't know about those of you that have to do annual reports, what you experience with this, but I was with Easter with my mother, and I was leaving for the airport, and she said, wait a second, I have a report for you. I said, what? She said, well, I read your annual report, and I've written you a report about your annual report. I said, okay, great. She goes, I understood this one. She goes, not the numbers, but I understood all the rest finally. And so what this annual report was, when I say professions, we chose to just do 50 professions that have really been changed by this kind of an era. And that, to me, was an inflection point. That this great competitive advantage would be about making better decisions in all of our, whether it's a company or a profession. Because that in itself is a $2 trillion industry, actually. And whether you choose to believe this or not, what I'm about to tell you is true. Those of us that make decisions every day, a third are great, a third are okay, and a third are not so good. And it's been proven over and over. So we all can benefit, but it's really for much more important reasons. And that's what I said. I hope what you take away is not about technology. What I believe we'll be able to do with this era, with data as a competitive advantage, these new systems, is we will really finally be able to solve what are some of the world's unsolvable problems. And I can already see it. We most recently finished some work with the University of North Carolina with their whole cancer center. And they did a study of 1,000 of the toughest oncology cases. And we applied Watson to it. Watson found 99.9% of exactly what the doctors found. But he also found 30% more. If we take a look at the work we've done with Medtronic, the ability to predict hypoglycemia 3 to 4 hours in advance. Those of you that know people with diabetes or who've had those attacks, if you can actually know in advance, you can do something about it. And this week is actually a week that looks at ways to help with Lou Gehrig's. And working with the Barrow Institute in Arizona, about 2 months ago, found 5 genes that have never been associated before with Lou Gehrig's disease, with ALS. So this is the world that's in front of us. Now, I want to end with my 5th question is, so if you believe in this wonderful world that's in front of us, what would you need to unleash it? So let me, if you don't mind, humor me a second. I want to read you something, just a few lines from something, and then I'm going to tell you what it is after you guess. It's a speech, not mine, written another day. It says, I want to talk to you today about the relationship between the current highly sophisticated machines in our economy and the men and women who work and think and make the economy what it is. I believe that this relationship is a dynamic alliance in which men are using new tools and powerful ways to improve their effectiveness and increase the pace of civilization in the world. I'm going to pick out one other. It says, now, however, we must forge a dynamic, successful, and continuing alliance with the machine, or we will see our economy slowed or our expectations thwarted. But in forging this alliance and making it flourish, we must confront uneasiness and fear. The fear of downgraded jobs, the fear of unemployment, and the fear of many other things. Take a guess, well, any guess what year this thing may have been written? It was, I found it, and I'm about what I'm going to tell you I did next. I actually hadn't read this first. This was written March 1965. It was given to the American Bankers Association by our founder's son, Thomas Watson Jr., 1965. It's as if I could have answered those questions on Fox News Friday, the same questions again. And so, well, what does that say about, never mind. Now, so really don't go down that. So what is needed in this era? That's really what I wanted to say. I read that, and what it really brings to mind and what I want to close on is these new eras, they come by so infrequently. It's really the responsibility, I feel, of companies like ours to usher these technologies safely into this world. And when I say safely, I want to end with really quickly something we've done. I did this in January. I was going to Davos and had thought long and hard about all the discussion about artificial intelligence. Is it good? Is it bad? What could it do? And we did something we hadn't done in a decade. So I issued a policy letter, and it was called The Principles for the Cognitive Era. And there are 3 principles that I think apply to every company in this room. The first one is that purpose matters. And our view is, and those of us who build these technologies, we can control a lot of this and should. And the purpose is that these technologies are here to augment what you and I do. They are to augment mankind, not to focus on replacing it. It is man and machine. The second thing is that we owe the world transparency. You need to know when this is used, but more important, you need to know who taught it and with what data. So if you were getting a cancer diagnosis, you'd want to know that it was the 20 best cancer institutes in the world that taught that system, not someone else. And then I'm going to end on the point of skills, because skills will matter, to what that letter said. This idea that, to thrive in this new generation, you are going to have different skills. It was a term I know I've coined called new collar. They're not blue collar skills. They're not white collar skills. They're new skills where technology will be a part of every job that is out there. And so an idea for this, and maybe Ilene and I will get to talk more about it, is something called Pathway to Technology Schools. But I bring it up because it's something we've done here in Chicago. This is a 4-year high school, 2-year community college. You could think of it as a 6-year high school. And it's a very simple concept. Be sure the school teaches a curriculum that business needs, offer your company's employees as mentors, and then, in fact, if you have a job, hire the kids. And so we started this, and I will tell you, we're up to 100 schools, 50,000 kids, and 300 other companies are with us helping mentor kids. But it was 2012, and Mayor Rahm Emanuel called and asked if IBM would come here and if we'd start one of these schools. So we partnered with the Chicago Public Schools and the Daly College, and we created the Sarah E. Good STEM Academy, Science, Technology, Engineering, Math, on the South Side. And our partners are here. So would you, I guess, really both indulge me, but I want to honor them. The school's principal, Armando Rodriguez. I just don't know what table these guys are at. And over here, why don't you guys stand? And the president of the Daly College, Dr. Jose Abar. Both are here. So this, to me, I want to thank them for their commitment, but if you also just give me one more indulgence, I want to introduce a couple of the kids that are here tonight, too. And so these, now, obviously, we've been at this a few years now. 13 kids are graduating, and they graduate with a high school degree and a 2-year associate degree. And some of these, they're so good. I mean, I've seen this everywhere in the country now. These kids are graduating 1 to 2 years early. So just think about that. In 4 years, they're getting done both those things here. And so the three that are here, let me start with Jacoby Chapman. 4 years got it done. An intern. And then Everardo Gutera, where are you? You're right next to him, I hope. Web developer, 4 years, hopeful new IBM employee. And Alexis Hill, 5-year, going to be a network designer, also graduating. So I'm going to end there in my introductory remarks, just that it's, to me, education is a good spot, the promise of education. You guys can sit down. I mean, you can stand all the time you want, but if everyone, one more time for these guys. To me, it was a good ending for this wonderful homecoming to end on the promise of education, because you just saw that's the promise of our future in front of you. And to me, it is a future where man and machine will work together to do some really wonderful things and solve some of the unsolvable problems. So with that, Ilene, why don't you join me? And my honor to answer a few questions. Good, thank you.
You've brought up a couple of ideas in my mind, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about technology and maybe a little bit about culture. And so I think this whole idea of artificial intelligence is very interesting. A lot of people are writing about it. So I was reading that Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates are a few famous thinkers who've urged caution when it comes to artificial intelligence. And so I know you talked a lot about that at Davos, but can you give us your thoughts on this? What is the caution that they're worried about?
How many of you feel that same caution? A couple? Yeah, because this falls in that category of what people should really talk about and have facts about. What they talk about are systems that are self-aware, able to, whether it was HAL, whatever these movies that they conjure up. And we have been at this so long, the state of technology is not there. You really do have to teach these systems. They do not become, and they won't be sentient, they won't be self-aware. And so these are one of the things, as you could tell from the comments I chose to open with, I think it's a misfortune. There are so many issues in this world that I believe will be solved with these. I see the work in healthcare, or I see the productivity in business systems, or I see the work in education, when you can match each individual child's learning style to what they need. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about healthcare, but you roll out an oncology assistant in a country where there's one oncologist for 1,600 doctors, or 1,600 patients. You're not going to be able to solve these problems otherwise. So to me, I have taken that on with them. I absolutely 100% scientifically disagree with it. And so you can go ahead and conjure all this fear. However, there are things that have to be addressed, but it isn't to that degree. And these are systems, and that's why I think it's really important that as we enter this era, I hated that it was called artificial intelligence. You might wonder how we ended up on the word calling it cognitive business, because I can remember my husband goes, hey, could you not pick a better word than that? Mm-hmm. You know, he's like, cognitive, really? And I said, no, the point is, it's not artificial intelligence, right? This is about augmenting intelligence. And so I really didn't want to keep reinforcing that point. It's how you help people think. And so you and I, we will do what we do best and be assisted. So that's a little bit of a long answer to
okay.
Scientifically not true, and in fact I think it really conjures up and puts efforts in the wrong spot when there's so much positive we could do.
Well, you talked about transparency, and I think that further reinforces what you're saying. I think Hollywood movies don't help, so obviously that's something you can't control.
I tell you, we had some fun at one time early on with Watson. We taught it, we emptied it, think of it this way, emptied its brain out and only taught it with Wikipedia. And so, and then we asked things like, you know, because you can debate with it, and said, can you make up a case for why you would stop social programs in Europe? No data in Wikipedia that would ever support that. So it's an example of, it depends who teaches it and what they teach it. And so it's really an important point.
So when it comes to cognitive computing, and I do like that word, you often speak of the idea of training rather than programming. And I don't think a lot of people here understand the difference. So could you give us a little more detail of what's the difference between training and programming.
I'll bet this wasn't top on their list of their questions. What do you think? I don't know. I'm going to guess. But this is an era that when I say train, they're algorithms. And so there's such a voracious amount of information, and it's in pictures and images, things that normal computers to date have not been able to understand. So these systems, through statistical algorithms, look over and over and over these things, and then they learn the patterns. And so that's how you train then, and they'll come up with answers. And we went through this in the early days. We picked one of the hardest things to start with, which was healthcare. And so we've been working for years and years and years now with doctors. And so, of course, a system has to learn a domain. It's got to learn medicine or learn underwriting or learn financial accounting or learn risk. It's got to learn these things. So just like you and I, as a child, they start low. Someone more learned interacts. You give an answer, you're wrong, corrected. You start to learn what to connect together. And that's how those systems work on big scale.
Right. Okay, good, thanks. Now, I do know that IBM, I've heard, spends roughly $6 billion a year on R&D, which is a lot of money, and you've described Watson as a modern-day moonshot. So what's the business model for Watson, and how do you know $6 billion is the right number?
Am I at an investor conference? Just checking. It was $15 billion last year, by the way, including R&D or acquisitions. Okay. So I don't know, for most companies in the room, I guess if you have lived long enough to have to reinvent yourself, where the word moonshot came from was, if you go back and look in the 1960s with the work of NASA landing the man on the moon, I'll go back and look in our archives. And IBM's had the pleasure, the honor, whether it was the census, whether it was landing the man on the moon, to play a pretty important role. There'll be pictures in the archives. Every other shirt says IBM on it. And so culturally, my whole life, I've grown up believing that institutions exist to do things that really matter. And you'll do lots of things that are normal for business, but then there must be things you do that will make a difference to why you exist. And so to me, Watson is our modern day moonshot. Like, we helped land the man on the moon and help him return. This is our moonshot, and the moonshot will be around healthcare. I think, and those of you I am so respectful of those in the profession. It's a daunting profession. A doctor, medical information doubles every 75 days. It's even compressing more. It is impossible to know how to do that job. And so that's why we started. Is it enough money? Different point. We started there with, if we could, the problems are so large in this country. Money in America is spent with no return, but it's the issues around the world, these diseases that can't be fought. So the progress we went down that path was, A, teaching Watson medicine. It can now pass the medical boards, although you might not be impressed when I tell you what percentage you can get right and still pass. So that we decided not to publish that part. So then after that, but we started in building a platform. And in fact, some of the companies that we bought, one in Chicago, Merge, part of that platform. We have more data now than other than a government, we have got more data that a client can come in and take their data and combine it. But we started with oncology, an oncology advisor to help do diagnosis and treatment. So we've read every document on oncology. It's been trained by the best cancer centers in the world, millions and millions of documents and tests. So we are now rolling out across India, China, Finland, South Asia, parts of Europe, Italy, and active treatment, 14,000 patients right now. Clinical trial matching, the Mayo Clinic, genomic sequencing. Now, if you're in late stage cancer, it'll be Watson behind Illumina and Quest Diagnostics to do the genomic sequence reading. If you have an MRI done, imaging, assistance read by that, and value-based care. So we've kind of gone through all of these things. That's the moonshot. And so to me, that is, I hope, what lays a foundation. Now, we've gone on to things like risk management and other things, but this is one that I think is both good for IBM and good for the world.
Yeah. Now, why did IBM buy the weather company? It's very different than healthcare. Is this purchase related to
in fact, I appreciate if all of you would check your weather and hit it 3 or 4 times tonight on your phone. If you watch a video, that's even better for us. Okay, so if talking about a business model.
Yeah.
But the reason that we bought the weather company, does anybody familiar with it? It's on your. Okay. Does that mean you don't like it, or you're? So it's on all Apple phones, and we also just actually won the business. Will be on all your Samsung phones too. And but the reason we bought it, people say, why did you buy it? It's Internet of Things. Weather impacts every decision you have to make. So if you're a financial company, Ed and Allstate, and Tom, it was everything everything impacts weather. True with financial services and the like. So for the world of Internet Things, that was going to really matter, was not only to have the data, but we collect data from 3 billion data points every single day on that. And so that's Internet of Things. Think of the massive amount of data that, whether it's from your car, whether it's going to be from your pacemaker, you have to be able to real time handle that. So that was why we did it. So it's been a great acquisition.
Great. Well, because I know in the agricultural and food business, of course, weather is very important.
But I don't care whether it's transportation, just about everything you can think of, right? Yeah.
Now, how do you see Watson entering the consumer space? Will we all have, I don't know, robots in our homes?
Well, this is an interesting point. How many, people may have, whether it's an Alexa or a Go, very consumer-oriented devices. They're mostly text, or speech to text. So it's really, in fact, kind of a simple way of describing it, taking what you say, converting it into text, putting it in a search engine, getting back out an answer. And that is one path it will go. We're really looking at a whole different class of problems. We're looking at the ones where you actually have to know the domain. You have to know, like I said, whether you're a doctor, an underwriter, a financial planner, a banker. So when I say it'll touch, and we've been counting 1 billion people, it will be through others. So as an example today, banks. I can name about 6 big banks. It's actually now Watson in their call centers helping those agents answer all of the questions. We had a great experience with a Grammy Award-winning music writer. And he used Watson to help him write a song. It's called It Ain't Easy. And it was the fastest to #1 on Spotify and Apple ever in history. And what he did was he used it to help him with what was the mood of the country. And I must tell you, we did this right before the election, and we're like, okay, we cannot publish that either. And so it was both a mood of a country, what beats and what mixtures create what kind of reactions. And so I think that of course touches X number of consumers at the other end, the medicine going on. So it's all through others is what that'll be. And that's, to me, how you'll experience most of these kind of technologies.
Now, speaking of technology, I've read a lot about blockchain and its potential, and I think it's a word that everybody would like to understand more about. So how is IBM thinking about blockchain?
I would take a poll. How many people want to know about blockchain here? Let me check. Okay. Rick Waddell, do you want to give that speech up there? Okay. He's got a great blockchain actual implementation that has just gone in. And so let me make it, maybe I'll give a very short answer to this. To me, blockchain is one of these next great technologies because it does something very simple. It will do for trusted transactions what the internet did for information. What did the internet do for information? Made it accessible. You can go on the internet and there's rules of the road on how to get to information. You don't know what they are, but they were all set up and there's rules of the road, and you trust that the information flows. Trusted transactions. If you could know who that person was on the other side all the time, you would trust a transaction. That's, in just short, what a blockchain does. And so it's a new technology, comes about because of cryptography, certain kinds of cryptography that can be there, and some standards being set. We're quite involved in the standard setting. So in other words, we've actually donated all of the code for blockchain to one of these big open standards groups. And there's now about 200 companies working on it. But it allows for trusted exchange between many partners and many parties of information. I was using Northern Trust as an example. I think these guys have done some really groundbreaking work on private equity in the placement of the capital and all the different parties involved in that across a blockchain. And not only is it a huge administration benefit, but the difference is all the trusted parties that don't have to go build one big system to trust each other. It became famous, by the way, with Bitcoin, but it's not Bitcoin. We're talking about the kind of technology that's underneath it and that can be used. Walmart, so think of it for food safety. We're rolling out work in China with Walmart. They'd had a big issue with pork. And so when the pork went bad, they got thrown out of all these stores. It had to close some of them. So in this case, think of it from farm to fork, farm to table, the kind of pork and where it's going. The other one is it is going to completely, those of you that are in any form of transportation, it's going to completely revolutionize, and it's already happening. We're doing work with Maersk, one of the big shipping lines, you wouldn't guess that to ship flowers from, now I know it because we've done it, from Kenya to Rotterdam, the containers that ship these things, the paperwork that goes with them costs more than the flowers. So these kind of trusted transactions through customs, through the bankers, through every different port that goes on, and how you can remove that friction. It's another one of these technologies that you'll layer on to what we're talking about that I think's got a chance to have some pretty big productivity improvements. Our estimate is several hundreds of billions of productivity.
Now, what role do you anticipate for voice technology? You talked a little bit about that in the commercial space, like voice search utilized in Alexa, Siri, Google Home. Do you see some changes in that?
Look, I think voice will be how many of us interact with all of these things. So we're doing work with General Motors OnStar so that you'll interact with voice. You do some of that already today, but even deeper with an understanding, right, of tell me what's the right time to go do this, the kinds of questions, not just search and look up of what you'll do. So voice will probably be the way you'll interact.
I have to admit that I do yell at that voice sometimes. So.
Yeah, no problem.
Now, how do we enable the current generation of the workforce to adapt and thrive on these new technologies? Yeah. I know the millennials, they have grown up with it, but how about your workforce? Do you see any differences in the different groups?
This is, to me, like we all have some passion that we work on. One of my biggest one has been about workforce development. So all the work I have done with the current administration and the prior has been on this topic. You met the kids here on PTech. This, to me, is one of the biggest issues this country faces, is about preparing people with skills. There are 5 million open jobs. There are 500,000 open jobs in technology in my own industry. So this isn't an issue of that there are not job openings here. The issue is having people with the right skills. And our education system, with all due respect to everybody in it, I mean, it could be a public-private partnership to improve it. And I think it's a misnomer to think that with these technologies, everybody has to have a PhD and a college degree. If we do that, it will cut out a large piece of our population. And so to raise these standards of living, raise these skill levels, I think there's a chance to scale the kind of education like I talked about with this Pathways to Technology. Other companies have some programs like these. Public-private partnership, you can scale those, apprenticeships, credentialing, and you would prepare a whole generation for what's going to be needed. Because some of these scare factors that are out there that they say jobs will be replaced, it isn't entire jobs really. I've done all sorts of studies. It'll be percentages of what you and I do that will be augmented. And therefore, we'll do what hopefully we do better, and these technologies will be there to assist us. So it will have some impact. That would be wrong to say it won't. I mean, technology has with every era here had some impact, right? When it put a premium when there was the agriculture and farming, when that went away, people had to read. The industrial age, you had to build these mechanical skills. Now, you're gonna have to build all these kind of, quote, data skills. And so I think the best thing we can do, and it can start young, but we can really tackle it right now in our high schools, our elementary and high schools, on how to deal with that. And then, of course, all of us that have companies, it's a lot of retraining. Right? I know we spend about $500 million in training every year.
But what about the current employees? You have a strong culture. Do you offer retraining as some skills are evolving?
We do. So about $500 million of training every year. And I think all of us are going to have to do much more of that now.
Now, do you think education will change in other ways? In other words, it's all about technology training in the schools. Are there opportunities outside of schools to train our people?
Well, this is, how many people offer apprenticeships with their companies? Does small, medium, just a few? I mean, this is, I think, one of the other big areas that we've talked a lot about that could scale in this whole country, this idea of apprenticeships. They're offered in places. There are other countries, I think Germany has been known for this, a really great job of apprenticeships as a model for an entire country to create kind of a third path through the country to build your skills. And I've been a broken record on this. There's a couple things in our government we could do. One is basic points. I break it in like 3 pieces. There is legislation, something called the Perkins Act, that is what gives community colleges all their funding. There's a bill that, yep, they used it, see? So there's a bill that actually went through the House of Representatives, believe it or not. It had 405 positive votes and like 2 no's or something. I mean, they don't do anything like that. So it got through, and so it needs to go to the Senate. All this says is that to a community college, to get your funding, you have to teach a curriculum that's employable. That seems like a pretty basic and agreeable thing to do. So we can do some simple things. The second thing is, though, believe it or not, there's billions of dollars in the government in things like work-study programs. So instead of having the kids sort of after school, sweep floors, do these kind of things, millions of companies, really small, medium business, take that same money and put them in apprenticeships. And while they're in school, they're going to learn how to do something. Big companies don't necessarily need that help, but lots of small, medium companies would need that help to have apprenticeships. And then this credentialing work, that if you get some skills, there's a credential that you can then transfer them and use them. So I am pretty optimistic that these are things that we're getting some motion going on that will be able to be actioned that would really make an imprint on skills in this country, which are really badly needed.
Now, do you encourage IBM employees then to work in the local schools, or?
They do. Like a lot of people in this room, I am positive do. I know some of my friends up on the dais here do. And it's this form of apprenticeship. And like I said, we have 300 other companies doing these Pathway to Technology schools. Very easy to do. All of us would volunteer. Many of that mentoring is done electronically.
Now, what advice do you give future leaders in pursuing a STEM career? I know you talked about the STEM schools.
You went to MIT too, right?
Right, that's absolutely.
So what advice do you give? I looked at the clock, I thought, you must be tired of me for a while. I'll switch that over. Yeah.
This is great.
Get a STEM degree.
Get a STEM degree and stay and focus on STEM in your jobs. And so, in terms of IBM, do you encourage employees to really focus on their STEM education and get a STEM position?
We do, but I have to tell you, you mentioned I went to Northwestern, and at the commencement speech I'd given, I felt really strong. People say advice, like what should they go into school? I do tell them to go into engineering, even if they don't want to be an engineer. I really feel the greatest thing when I said I owed this city, this school here a lot. I said what I felt Northwestern did for me in engineering was it just taught me how to solve problems. And I was a practicing engineer for just a short time. And so that to me, no matter what walk of life you want to go into, I think unfortunately, you're going to have problems. And so that idea that that's what engineering does, which is why I'm such a strong advocate of particularly trying to get more and more young women to go into science, technology, engineering, and math. It's really for that purpose of it will prepare you for almost anything you want to do.
And why do you think people, with these women coming out of school with the STEM degrees, why don't they end up in a STEM job?
Well, I tell you what, there are a lot of stereotypes to overcome on this topic, right? And I don't think it's any different than as you deal with, there are many different jobs that have stereotypes against them like this. And so you need role models, and you just have to keep pulling people in. I don't know if anybody's been involved in things like Girls Who Code. They've got a commitment to get 1 million girls into coding, and these summer camps and all. And that once they go and they do it, they're like, I can do this. And then carry on through into high school and into college on this. And so I really believe it's got to do with role models and exposing kids to this.
I think that's great advice to everybody in the room, because everybody here can be a role model to these young women.
Or if you have kids, your grandkids, put them in one of those camps for a week. And I've watched it change lots of kids.
Now, I read that Warren Buffett owns nearly 9% of your stock. So what's it like to have Warren Buffett as your largest shareholder?
Well, I would not make a comment about any shareholder. But I mean, in this day and age, I mean, having any of our shareholders, I think you and I were talking about this, right, nowadays, that you've got a lot of constituents out there. You have your shareholders, you've got the media, you've got your clients, and what is it like to manage across? And in this day of certainly social media, it is all about trying to manage that narrative for yourself and be sure you communicate clearly.
So do you see that increasing, or will that change over time? Or?
Look, I think for all of us in this day and age, right, the amount of time that if you don't grab hold of your own narrative, somebody else grabs hold of it, right? I've certainly been through that many times.
Now, one of the questions that I received was about Watson. Is Watson have a gender?
Oh, that's so funny.
How many of you were thinking of that?
Did you think of that one?
No, I've been getting a lot of questions on that.
So obviously now you know the reason it was named Watson was IBM's founder is Watson. And so to me it was very natural, and even I refer to it as a he, but it's only because of that's in my mind, right, that he was a he. And so I call it he. But the funny story behind it when that voice you heard on that little video, because occasionally there was a voice, and we did testing. We did testing on a woman's voice, a child's voice, all different kinds. And I have to tell you, like the child, people really did not like the thought of a really brilliant child. It was a funny thing. They were like, nope. And so we ended up with this kind of voice. It sort of was this neutral thing in the middle that everybody wanted, but it's really not gender specific. That was really after our founder, yep.
Okay, well, I'm winding down here, so here's my final question. Now, assuming it had the intelligence to answer, what would be, if you could ask Watson any question right now, other than maybe the cure for cancer, what would that question be? Have you thought about that?
Boy, I haven't thought about that.
Cubs or Sox?
Oh, I guess if it was a year ago, I would have said, would the Cubs win, right?
Yeah,
but
right.
That's been answered for you, or your prayers have been answered, or whatever, right? Let's see. You know, I think the kinds of questions you'd ask would have more to do about how to solve some of these problems. So whether it would be how to solve something like cancer, how to solve, I mean, there's a whole list of these horrible diseases that are out there that, to me, really, I mean, we are so blessed in a country like this and in a city like this, but you go to so many other parts of the world, they're just endemic. And so it would probably have to do with solving, you know, the top three, right? Between diabetes, between cancer, between heart, it would have to do with the answer to one of those questions.
Well, I think when you talk about science and solving those problems, that would be wonderful. So again, thank you, Ginni. We appreciate you being with us for your candid conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.